The sun was merciless over the Salt Lake Desert in 1847, turning the cracked earth into a furnace that claimed lives without warning. Ernesto Martinez wiped the sweat from his brow as he spotted movement behind a cluster of rocks, a mother donkey and her two foals, barely breathing, abandoned and dying of thirst. Most pioneers would have kept walking. They had their own survival to worry about. But Ernesto wasn't most pioneers. Before joining Brigham Young's company, he'd been a veterinarian in Mexico, a healer who understood that every life had purpose. As he poured his precious water into his cupped hands, watching the donkeys drink with desperate gratitude, something extraordinary began to unfold. The mother donkey looked into his eyes with an intelligence that seemed almost human. Within hours, these animals would lead him to something hidden in the desert, something that would save not just his wagon train, but dozens of families who had given up hope. But how could animals that were nearly dead just hours before suddenly possess an uncanny ability to navigate the treacherous terrain like seasoned guides? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ernesto's hands trembled as he watched the water disappear between the mother donkey's parched lips. Each drop he offered meant less for his own survival, but he couldn't stop himself. The animal's dark eyes held a depth of suffering that reminded him of his patients back in Guadalajara, the same quiet desperation, the same plea for mercy. The larger of the two foals, a dusty brown creature with white patches around its muzzle, struggled to stand. Its legs shook like brittle branches in a windstorm, but there was determination in its movement that struck Ernesto as oddly familiar. The smaller foal remained pressed against its mother's side, breathing in short, labored gasps. "Easy, mi amigo," Ernesto whispered, running his weathered hand along the mother's neck. Her coat was matted with dust and salt, but underneath he could feel the strong heartbeat of a survivor. "We're going to get through this together." Ernesto pulled his water skin from his belt, barely a quarter full now, and created a small puddle in a depression between the rocks. The foals approached cautiously, their instincts warring between desperation and fear. As they drank, he noticed something peculiar. The mother donkey had moved away from the water and was facing southeast, her ears pricked forward as if listening to something beyond human perception. "What is it, Senora?" he asked softly. In his years treating animals, he'd learned to read their behavior like scripture. This wasn't random wandering, this was purpose. The donkey took a few steps in the direction she'd been facing, then stopped and looked back at Ernesto. When he didn't follow, she repeated the motion, more insistent this time. The foals, still weak but noticeably more alert after drinking, flanked their mother and gazed at Ernesto with the same expectant expression. A shout echoed across the desert. "Martinez, we're moving out!" Samuel Porter's voice carried an edge of finality. If Ernesto didn't catch up soon, he'd be left to face the desert alone. He looked at the donkey family, then at the distant wagons kicking up dust clouds on the horizon. Every rational thought told him to abandon these animals and save himself. But the mother donkey's behavior nagged at him. In Mexico, he'd seen animals exhibit remarkable intuition during droughts, leading farmers to underground springs, guiding lost travelers back to roads. Could these creatures sense something he couldn't? The mother donkey took several more steps southeast, moving with growing confidence despite her recent brush with death. She turned back once more, and Ernesto could swear he saw something like urgency in her expression. "All right," he said, gathering his sparse belongings. "Show me what you know." He followed the donkey family away from the established trail, his boots sinking into sand that seemed to shift and breathe beneath him. The sun climbed higher, and with each step, the distant sounds of the wagon train faded until only the whisper of wind across stone remained. The mother donkey moved with increasing certainty, her pace quickening as if she were following a map written in scents and sounds invisible to human senses. The foals kept close, their earlier weakness replaced by an alertness that bordered on the supernatural. After an hour of walking through terrain that seemed identical in its barren hostility, the mother donkey stopped at what appeared to be an unremarkable patch of desert. She began pawing at the ground with her front hooves, scraping away loose sand and exposing something darker underneath. Ernesto knelt beside her and brushed away more sand with his hands. His fingers touched something cool and wet. He dug deeper, his heart racing, until water began to seep into the small depression he'd created. A hidden spring. The Jenny's breathing had grown so shallow that Ernesto had to lean close to detect the faint rise and fall of her ribs. Her foal lay motionless beside her, and for a terrible moment he thought both animals had passed. Then the young donkey's ear twitched, and Ernesto felt a surge of desperate hope. Water. That was the first necessity. His own supply was running dangerously low, but he couldn't stand by and watch these creatures die of thirst. He retrieved his canteen and carefully dripped water onto the Jenny's cracked lips. At first nothing happened, but then her tongue moved slightly, seeking the moisture. "Easy now, girl," he whispered, continuing to let the precious liquid pool at the corner of her mouth. "Just a little at a time." The foal stirred when Ernesto repeated the process, its dark eyes opening briefly before closing again. The spark of life was still there, but barely. He looked around the barren landscape, calculating distances to water sources he knew existed somewhere in this vast emptiness. The nearest spring was at least 2 days' hard travel, and these animals couldn't survive the journey in their current condition. Ernesto had always been practical about such matters. On the frontier, difficult decisions were part of survival. The merciful thing would be to end their suffering quickly and continue his journey to Salt Lake City. Brother Kimball was expecting his report on the southern settlements, and every day's delay could affect the welfare of the growing communities. But as he reached for the pistol at his hip, something made him pause. The Jenny had opened her eyes and was looking directly at him. There was an intelligence there that seemed almost human, a silent plea that went beyond mere animal instinct. Her gaze held his with such intensity that his hand fell away from the weapon. Instead, he found himself examining their condition more carefully. The Jenny bore old harness marks on her shoulders and withers, evidence of a working life. The foal, despite its weakened state, showed good bone structure and conformation. These weren't wild animals. They had belonged to someone, had been cared for. How they had come to be abandoned in this desolate place was a mystery, but their trust in humans remained intact. Ernesto made his decision with the same quiet determination that had carried him across oceans and continents to reach this promised land. He would not abandon them. Working quickly, he used his knife to cut sections from his spare shirt, fashioning crude slings that would allow him to transport water more efficiently. The nearest reliable water source was a hidden canyon he had discovered years earlier while scouting for the church. It was closer than the main spring, perhaps a day's journey if he pushed hard. He loaded his mule with only the most essential supplies, leaving behind anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. The animal protested the reduced load with suspicious ears and sideways glances, but Ernesto paid no attention. Time was running short. Before departing, he used his remaining spare cloth to create makeshift shade for the donkeys, anchoring it with rocks and his walking stick. The shelter was pitiful, but it might provide a few degrees of relief from the merciless sun. He left them with another small portion of water, knowing it might be the difference between life and death. The journey to the hidden canyon tested every ounce of Ernesto's desert knowledge. He navigated by landmarks invisible to untrained eyes. A distinctively weathered rock formation, the subtle change in sand color that indicated underground water. The way certain hardy plants grew in patterns that revealed the secrets of the landscape. As he traveled, memories of his conversion to the Mormon faith filled his mind. He had been drawn to the church's teachings about eternal families, about the sacred nature of all creation. The missionaries in his native village had spoken of a God who cared for every sparrow, who numbered the hairs on every head. Did that divine concern extend to abandoned donkeys in the Utah desert? The sun was setting when he finally located the canyon entrance, a narrow cleft in the rock that would have been invisible from even a short distance. Inside, the walls rose on either side, creating blessed shade and protection from the wind. At the far end, water seeped from the stone to form a small but reliable pool. Ernesto filled every container he possessed, then began the return journey through the cooling darkness. The desert at night was a different world, full of subtle sounds and mysterious movements. Coyotes called in the distance, their voices echoing off the canyon walls and mesas. An owl swept past on silent wings, startling his mule. By dawn, he was within sight of his makeshift camp. His heart pounded as he approached, fearing what he might find. The cloth shelter still stood, but no movement came from beneath it. For a moment, Ernesto was certain his efforts had been in vain, that he would find only the still forms of creatures who had passed beyond his help. Then he heard it, the faint but unmistakable sound of breathing. Both animals still lived. The dying Jenny's eyes held something Ernesto had never seen before in an animal, a depth that seemed almost human. As he knelt beside her in the pre-dawn darkness, her labored breathing created small clouds in the cold desert air. The two foals pressed closer to their mother, and Ernesto noticed something peculiar. They weren't making the typical braying sounds of distressed donkeys. Instead, they emitted soft, almost musical whimpers that seemed to harmonize with the wind. "Easy now," Ernesto whispered, reaching slowly toward the Jenny's neck. The moment his weathered hand made contact with her matted fur, she stopped struggling, her wild eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that made him shiver. It was as if she were trying to communicate something urgent, something beyond her own suffering. Working quickly, Ernesto retrieved his water skin and medical supplies from his saddlebags. The Jenny's breathing had become increasingly shallow, and he feared he might lose her before sunrise. As he cleaned the infected wounds on her legs, she remained perfectly still, watching him with those impossibly expressive eyes. The larger foal, a dark brown male with white markings around his muzzle, stepped forward and gently nuzzled Ernesto's shoulder. The gesture was so deliberate, so human-like in its timing, that Ernesto paused in his ministrations. The foal's eyes held the same unusual depth as his mother's, and for a moment Ernesto felt as though he were in the presence of something far more complex than simple desert animals. "What are you trying to tell me?" he murmured, addressing the Jenny directly. In response, she lifted her head with tremendous effort and turned toward the east, where the first pale hints of dawn were beginning to show. She made a low, melodic sound, not quite a bray, but something closer to a song, and both foals immediately echoed the call. The sound sent chills down Ernesto's spine. In his 23 years of desert life, he had never heard anything like it. The melody seemed to resonate with the very rocks around them, creating an ethereal echo that lingered long after the animals fell silent. Working by the light of his oil lamp, Ernesto cleaned and bandaged the Jenny's wounds, applied salve to the foal's minor cuts, and gradually coaxed small amounts of water into each of them. The Jenny's condition improved slightly, though she remained too weak to stand. As the eastern sky began to lighten, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, something extraordinary happened. The Jenny struggled to her feet. Ernesto had seen enough injured animals to know that she shouldn't have been able to stand, let alone walk. Yet there she was, swaying but upright, her dark eyes now bright with renewed life. The foals immediately flanked her, and together the three animals turned toward Ernesto. What happened next would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Jenny approached him slowly, her movements deliberate and careful. When she reached him, she gently pressed her forehead against his chest and held it there for several long moments. Ernesto could feel her heartbeat through her skull, strong and steady now, and something else, a warmth that seemed to spread through his entire body. Then, one by one, the foals repeated the gesture. As the smaller one, a pale grey female, pressed her tiny head against his ribs, Ernesto experienced something that defied rational explanation. For just an instant he could sense what she was feeling. Gratitude, yes, but also something deeper, love, trust, and beneath it all, an intelligence that seemed to recognize not just what he had done, but why he had done it. When the moment passed, Ernesto staggered backward, his heart racing. The 3 donkeys stood before him in perfect stillness, their eyes reflecting the growing dawn light. Then, as if responding to some unheard signal, they turned and began walking toward the rising sun. "Wait!" Ernesto called out, but they didn't stop. He watched in amazement as the Jenny, who minutes before had been at death's door, walked with steady, purposeful steps across the desert floor. The foals kept pace beside her, and together they moved with a strange, almost ceremonial dignity. As they crested a small rise, the Jenny turned back one final time. Across the growing distance, Ernesto could swear he saw her nod, a distinctly human gesture of acknowledgement and farewell. Then they were gone, disappearing into the vast expanse of the Utah desert like spirits returning to whatever realm had sent them. Ernesto stood alone in the growing daylight, surrounded by the evidence of what had transpired: blood-stained bandages, empty water containers, the impression in the sand where the Jenny had lain dying. But already he was beginning to question his own memories. Had it really happened the way he remembered? Had those eyes truly held such impossible depth? The only answer was the lingering echo of that haunting melody, still resonating somewhere deep in his chest, like a song he would never forget. The mare's breathing had steadied by dawn, though she remained motionless in the makeshift shelter Ernesto had constructed from his wagon's canvas and scattered desert wood. Her foal pressed close against her flank, no longer trembling but still weak from their ordeal. Ernesto had spent the night alternating between prayer and vigil, watching over the animals as if they were his own children. As the first light painted the red rocks golden, something extraordinary happened. The mare's eyes opened, not with the glazed look of approaching death, but with a clarity that made Ernesto's breath catch. She lifted her head slowly, deliberately, and looked directly at him. In that gaze, he saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his days, an intelligence so profound it seemed almost human. "Easy now, girl," he whispered, extending his weathered hand toward her muzzle. She didn't flinch. Instead, she pressed her nose gently against his palm, and in that moment of contact, Ernesto felt something pass between them, not just trust, but understanding. The foal stirred, struggling to its feet on unsteady legs. Within minutes, it was nursing, and the mare was attempting to stand. Ernesto marveled at their resilience, but what happened next defied everything he thought he knew about wild animals. The mare stood and walked not toward the open desert, but directly to Ernesto's water barrel. She nudged it with her nose, then looked back at him with that same penetrating gaze. When he didn't immediately respond, she repeated the action, more insistently this time. "You want me to follow you to water?" Ernesto asked aloud, feeling foolish for speaking to an animal as if it could understand complex speech. But the mare bobbed her head in what could only be described as a nod, then began walking toward a cluster of rocks about 50 yards away. Ernesto grabbed his shovel and followed, the foal trailing behind its mother. At the rocks, the mare pawed at a specific spot in the sand, then stepped back and watched expectantly. Ernesto had been searching for water since his arrival. Any experienced desert traveler would. But he had found nothing in this area. Still, something compelled him to dig. The well was partially filled with sand, but as Ernesto dug deeper, seepage began to darken the earth. Fresh water, clean and cold, began to pool at the bottom. He had found not just water, but enough to refill his barrels and sustain them all for the remainder of his journey. But how had the mare known? She had been dying when he found her, barely conscious, yet somehow she had guided him to salvation. As if reading his thoughts, she approached the well's edge and drank deeply, her foal joining her. While the animals recovered their strength, Ernesto sat in the shade and tried to make sense of what had happened. His faith taught him that the Lord worked through all his creatures, but this felt different. This felt like communication, like partnership. The mare hadn't just been saved by his compassion. She had returned the favor with knowledge he couldn't have gained on his own. As the day progressed, more inexplicable things occurred. When Ernesto hitched his oxen to continue his journey, the mare and her foal fell into step beside the wagon without any coercion. They stayed just close enough to be traveling companions, but far enough away to maintain their wild dignity. When he stopped to rest at midday, they stopped too. When he resumed travel, they followed. But most remarkably, the mare seemed to anticipate dangers before they materialized. Late in the afternoon, she suddenly stopped and turned toward a rocky outcrop, her ears forward and alert. Moments later, Ernesto heard the unmistakable rattle that had made her freeze. A diamondback coiled on the path ahead, perfectly camouflaged against the desert floor. Without the mare's warning, Ernesto or his oxen might have stepped directly on the snake. Instead, he was able to guide his team safely around the danger, while the mare and foal took a wide detour through the brush. That evening, as Ernesto made camp beside a red rock formation, he watched the mare grazing peacefully with her foal nearby. The transformation was complete, from near death to vibrant health in less than 24 hours. But more than their physical recovery, something fundamental had changed in their relationship with him. They weren't just wild animals anymore, and he wasn't just another human to avoid. They had become something new together, bound by an experience that transcended the normal boundaries between species. As darkness fell over the Utah desert, Ernesto realized his simple act of mercy had opened a door to something far greater than he had ever imagined possible. The morning sun painted the canyon walls in shades of amber and rust as Ernesto knelt beside the donkey family, watching their steady breathing with a mixture of wonder and concern. 3 days had passed since he'd found them near death, and while their recovery seemed nothing short of miraculous, something else was happening that he couldn't quite name. The smallest donkey, barely more than a foal, had taken to following him everywhere, not just trailing behind as animals sometimes did, but moving in perfect synchronization with his steps. When Ernesto paused to check his water supply, the little one paused too. When he turned to scan the horizon, the donkey's head would swivel in the exact same direction at the exact same moment. "What are you looking at, pequeño?" Ernesto whispered, crouching down to meet the animal's dark, intelligent eyes. The foal stepped closer, close enough that Ernesto could feel its warm breath against his weathered hands. For a heartbeat, he could have sworn he sensed something, not words exactly, but a feeling of gratitude, so profound it made his chest tighten. The mother donkey had regained enough strength to stand and move about their makeshift camp. She watched Ernesto with an intensity that unnerved him. There was recognition there, something deeper than the usual wariness of a wild animal. When he approached with water, she didn't flinch. When he checked the wounds on her flanks, she stood perfectly still, as if she understood his intentions. But it was the father who troubled Ernesto most. The large male had been closest to death when Ernesto found them, his breathing so shallow it was barely detectable. Now he stood tall and alert, but there was something in his bearing that seemed almost human. The way he positioned himself between his family and the open desert, the calculated manner in which he tested the wind, it reminded Ernesto of the sentries back in his settlement. As if responding to his thoughts, the male donkey turned and fixed Ernesto with a steady gaze. For a long moment, neither moved. Then the animal did something that made Ernesto's breath catch in his throat. The donkey bowed his head once, deliberately, in what could only be described as a nod of acknowledgement. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of distant rain and something else, something that made the donkey's ears prick forward in unison. Ernesto turned to follow their gaze and saw dust rising on the horizon, riders moving fast across the hardpan. His hand instinctively moved to the rifle at his side. This far from any settlement, strangers rarely brought good news. The donkey family seemed to sense his tension. The mother moved protectively closer to her foal, while the father stepped forward, placing himself between the approaching riders and his family. As the dust cloud drew nearer, Ernesto could make out 3 horses and their riders. They rode with the hard efficiency of men accustomed to covering great distances quickly. When they were still 100 yards out, the lead rider raised his hand in greeting, but something in the gesture felt more like a warning than a welcome. "Afternoon, friend," the man called out as they approached. He was lean and sun-darkened, with the look of someone who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. His companions flanked him slightly, their hands resting casually but deliberately near their weapons. Mighty strange place for a camp. Ernesto kept his voice steady. Just resting through the heat of the day. Waterhole's good here. The lead rider's eyes moved past Ernesto to the donkey family. Those are some fine-looking animals. Don't see many donkeys in this good condition out here in the wild. Found them a few days back, Ernesto said carefully. They were in poor shape. Thought I'd help them recover before moving on. One of the other riders, a younger man with pale eyes and a cruel mouth, urged his horse forward. Mighty charitable of you. We've been tracking stolen livestock for the better part of a week. These animals match the description we're looking for. Ernesto's jaw tightened. These donkeys were dying when I found them, half dead from thirst and exposure. That so? The pale-eyed man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Well, stolen animals tend to be ridden hard. Makes sense they'd be in poor condition. Behind him, Ernesto heard a soft sound, barely audible but unmistakably protective. The father donkey had moved closer, positioning himself where he could see all three riders. The animal's nostrils flared as he tested their scent, and something in his posture suggested he found it wanting. We'll need to take them back to town, the lead rider said, his tone suggesting the matter was settled. You're welcome to come along and state your case to the sheriff. Ernesto felt the weight of the moment settling around him like the desert heat. Whatever was happening here, whatever strange bond had formed between him and these animals, it was about to be tested in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The morning sun cast long shadows across the makeshift shelter as Ernesto stirred from his restless sleep. His dreams had been filled with strange visions, golden light emanating from the donkey's eyes, whispered conversations in a language he couldn't understand, and an overwhelming sense that something profound was unfolding beyond his comprehension. He rubbed his weathered face and glanced toward the animals. What he saw made him question whether he was still dreaming. The mother donkey, who had been barely clinging to life just hours before, was standing upright. Not merely standing, but alert, her ears pricked forward with an intelligence that seemed almost human. The foal, previously weak and stumbling, moved with surprising grace around its mother, occasionally nuzzling against her flank with what appeared to be deliberate affection. Ernesto sat up slowly, afraid that any sudden movement might shatter this impossible scene. The animals turned toward him in unison, their dark eyes holding a depth of awareness that sent a chill down his spine. In all his years working with livestock, he had never encountered anything like this. Well, I'll be, he whispered, his voice barely audible in the desert stillness. The mother donkey stepped forward, her gait steady despite the ordeal she had endured. She approached Ernesto with purpose, stopping just within arm's reach. Then, in a gesture that defied every natural instinct he understood about wild animals, she lowered her head and gently pressed it against his chest. The contact sent a jolt through Ernesto's body, not painful but electric with meaning. Images flashed through his mind, vast migrations across ancient landscapes, generations of these animals serving alongside humans, carrying burdens and sharing hardships. He saw flashes of biblical scenes, donkeys bearing precious cargo, standing witness to moments of divine significance. When the vision faded, Ernesto found himself trembling. The donkey had stepped back and was watching him with those impossibly knowing eyes. The foal had moved to stand beside its mother, both animals maintaining a patient vigil as if waiting for him to process what had just occurred. "What are you?" Ernesto asked aloud, feeling foolish for speaking to animals yet compelled to voice his bewilderment. The response came not in words, but in action. The mother donkey walked to the edge of their shelter and looked out toward the horizon, her posture suggesting anticipation. The foal followed, both animals positioning themselves as if preparing for a journey. Ernesto gathered his belongings with shaking hands, his mind racing with questions that had no rational answers. As a man of faith, he had always believed in miracles, but experiencing one firsthand was overwhelming. He thought of his wife Sarah, of their struggles to start a family, of the prayers that seemed to echo unanswered across the vast wilderness. Perhaps this encounter was meant to teach him something about faith itself. The small procession began moving across the desert floor just as the sun climbed higher, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. Ernesto led his own animals while the donkey family walked alongside, no longer as rescued creatures but as companions. The mother donkey seemed to know exactly where they were heading, occasionally adjusting their course with subtle directional changes that Ernesto found himself following without question. As they traveled, Ernesto noticed other changes. His horses, typically skittish around unfamiliar animals, remained calm and attentive. His pack mule, usually stubborn and prone to balking, moved with unusual cooperation. It was as if the presence of the donkey family had brought a sense of harmony to the entire group. The heat of the day should have been oppressive, but somehow the journey felt less arduous than it should have. Ernesto found himself walking with more energy than he had felt in days, his water supplies seeming to last longer than they should have in the brutal desert conditions. During their midday rest, as they sheltered beneath a rocky outcropping, Ernesto watched the foal play in the sand with movements that seemed almost choreographed. The young animal would trace patterns in the dust with its hooves, creating designs that looked remarkably like symbols Ernesto had seen in ancient texts. When he moved closer to examine the markings, a gentle breeze swept across the desert floor, erasing the patterns before he could make sense of them. The mother donkey approached him again, this time carrying something in her mouth, a small, smooth stone that gleamed with an unusual iridescence. She dropped it at his feet and stepped back. Ernesto picked up the stone, feeling its surprising warmth against his palm. The surface seemed to shimmer with its own inner light, and he found himself thinking of the sacred stones mentioned in Scripture, objects that served as tangible connections between the earthly and divine realms. As afternoon approached, Ernesto realized they were no longer following his original route. The donkey family was leading them somewhere specific, and despite every logical instinct telling him to maintain his planned course, he felt compelled to trust their guidance. Whatever was happening transcended normal understanding, and he sensed that resistance would mean missing something extraordinary. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Ernesto led the donkey family toward what appeared to be an impossible sight. Where yesterday there had been nothing but cracked earth and dying scrub brush, now a small oasis of green grass stretched before them, glistening with dew that shouldn't exist in this parched land. Magdalena stopped short, her ears pricked forward in wonder. The two foals pressed close to her flanks, their eyes wide with an intelligence that seemed to grow stronger each day. Cisco stepped forward cautiously, his nostrils flaring as he tested the air. The scent of fresh water and living earth filled his lungs, a miracle in this desolate place. "I don't understand it either," Ernesto whispered, his voice hoarse with amazement. He knelt and touched the grass with trembling fingers. The blades were real, cool and moist against his weathered palm. A small spring bubbled up from rocks that hadn't been there the evening before, creating a clear pool that reflected the morning sky like polished glass. As the donkeys moved toward the water with reverent steps, Ernesto noticed something that made his breath catch. Their hoofprints from the previous day were still visible in the hardpan earth surrounding this new oasis, but within the green circle, the ground showed no sign of disturbance. It was as if this place had existed for years, waiting patiently for their arrival. Magdalena lowered her head to drink, and the moment her lips touched the water, a subtle vibration seemed to pulse through the earth. Ernesto felt it in his bones, a rhythm like a heartbeat, steady and strong. The foals drank next, their small muzzles creating gentle ripples that caught the light like scattered diamonds. When Cisco finally approached the spring, the vibration intensified, and Ernesto could swear he heard something like music carried on the desert wind. The sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the peaceful moment. Ernesto spun around to see three riders cresting the ridge, their silhouettes dark against the brightening sky. His heart hammered against his ribs as he recognized the lead figure. Samuel Bridger, one of the most ruthless cattle barons in the territory, known for his cruelty to both man and beast. "Well, well," Bridger called out as he guided his horse down the slope, his companions flanking him like hunting wolves. "If it isn't the donkey lover himself. Heard you've been harboring some valuable livestock, Ernesto." The donkeys clustered together near the spring, but instead of showing fear, they stood with an odd dignity. Magdalena positioned herself between the approaching riders and her foals, while Cisco moved to Ernesto's side. The vibration from the earth grew stronger, and Ernesto noticed the grass around the donkeys seemed to shimmer with an inner light. "These animals aren't for sale, Bridger," Ernesto said, his hand instinctively moving to the worn handle of his knife. "Found them near dead in the desert. They're under my protection now." Bridger laughed, a sound like grinding stones. "Protection from a dirt-poor Mormon farmer?" He spat into the dust, his cold eyes taking in the impossible oasis. "What in the Sam Hill is this place? Wasn't nothing here when we rode through last week?" "The desert provides," Ernesto replied simply, though his own mind reeled with questions he couldn't answer. One of Bridger's men, a thin scarecrow named Pike, urged his mount closer to the spring. "Boss, you seeing what I'm seeing? This water's clearer than any I ever—" His words died as his horse suddenly reared, whinnying in terror. The animal's eyes rolled white as it fought against Pike's attempts to control it, backing away from the oasis as if from a wall of flame. The other horses began to prance nervously, their riders struggling to keep them calm. "What's wrong with these damn animals?" Bridger snarled, sawing at his reins as his bay gelding spun in tight circles, refusing to approach the green sanctuary. Magdalena stepped forward then, her head held high. She didn't bray or make any sound, but something passed between her and the frightened horses, a communication beyond human understanding. One by one the horses settled, though they remained firmly planted outside the circle of grass, their ears flicking nervously. "Witchcraft," Pike whispered, his face pale beneath his weathered hat. "Ain't natural, none of this." Bridger's expression darkened. "I don't care if it's the devil's own magic. Those donkeys are coming with us." He started to dismount, but the moment his boot touched the ground, his horse bolted, leaving him sprawling in the dust. The earth's vibration reached a crescendo, and Ernesto felt something shift in the very air around them. The spring's gentle bubbling became a song, harmonies layering upon each other in a melody that spoke of ancient wisdom and timeless bonds. The foals lifted their heads in unison, their young voices joining the chorus in a sound that was part bray, part hymn, part prayer. Bridger scrambled to his feet, his face twisted with rage and fear. "This ain't over, farmer," he spat, catching his spooked horse. "Mark my words, this ain't over." As the three riders retreated, Ernesto sank to his knees beside the spring, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd witnessed. The morning brought no relief from the heat, only a different quality of light that seemed to pierce through Ernesto's very soul as he knelt beside the small donkey foal. 3 days had passed since he'd first discovered the dying family, and while the mother and her elder offspring showed remarkable improvement, little Esperanza remained caught between worlds, breathing but barely clinging to life. Sarah had arrived at dawn with fresh water and supplies, her face grave with unspoken concern. She watched as Ernesto continued his vigil, his weathered hands never leaving the tiny creature's side. The other settlers had begun to whisper among themselves, wondering if their fellow pioneer had lost his mind to the desert sun. But Sarah saw something different in Ernesto's eyes, a clarity that seemed almost otherworldly. "The elders are asking questions," she said quietly, settling beside him in the shade of the makeshift shelter he'd constructed. "They want to know when you're planning to return to your duties with the wagon train." Ernesto's fingers traced gentle circles on Esperanza's flank, feeling the shallow rise and fall of her breathing. "Tell them I'll return when the Lord's work here is finished." "And what work is that exactly?" Sarah's voice carried no judgment, only genuine curiosity. Before Ernesto could answer, something extraordinary occurred. The little foal's eyes, which had remained closed since he'd found her, slowly opened. But these were not the dark, simple eyes of a donkey. They held a depth and intelligence that made both humans catch their breath. More unsettling still, when Esperanza looked directly at Ernesto, he felt a presence touch his mind. gentle, grateful, and utterly alien to anything he'd experienced. Sarah gasped and scrambled backward. "Ernesto, what?" The connection lasted only seconds before the foal's eyes fluttered closed again, but in that brief moment, Ernesto understood with crystalline clarity that his world had fundamentally changed. This was no ordinary animal he'd rescued. The desert had given him something that challenged every assumption he'd held about the nature of God's creatures. "Did you see?" Sarah began, her voice trembling. "I saw," Ernesto replied, though he wasn't certain what exactly they had witnessed. The moment felt too significant for words, too profound for their limited human understanding. Throughout the day, other signs manifested that defied rational explanation. When buzzards circled overhead, as they had for days, Esperanza's mother, whom Ernesto had begun calling Milagro, would emit a low musical sound that seemed to send the scavengers fleeing. The injured donkey that Ernesto had named Valiente displayed an uncanny ability to sense approaching dust storms minutes before any human could detect them, positioning himself protectively over the smaller animals. But it was Esperanza who remained the center of the mystery. Despite taking no food or water, she continued breathing. Her tiny heart beat with steady determination, as if sustained by some force beyond the physical realm. When Ernesto placed his hand on her side, he felt something he could only describe as warmth spreading through his own body, not heat from the sun, but something deeper, more healing. As evening approached, other members of the wagon train began venturing near their small camp. Word had spread about the strange events, and curiosity overcame their initial skepticism. Old Henrik, the Norwegian blacksmith, arrived first, his practical nature warring with what his eyes were telling him. "This isn't natural," he muttered, watching as Milagro seemed to guide Valiente in arranging small stones into an almost perfect circle around their resting area. "Animals don't behave this way." "Perhaps," Ernesto replied, never taking his eyes off Esperanza. "We don't understand how animals truly behave." Soon, a small crowd had gathered, their faces reflecting a mixture of awe, confusion, and growing reverence. Even Brother Kimball, one of the more conservative elders, stood at the edge of the group, his stern expression gradually softening as he witnessed the peaceful scene. As the sun set, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Esperanza's eyes opened once more. This time, she looked not just at Ernesto, but at each person present, and in that moment, every soul gathered felt the same inexplicable connection, a sense of being seen, truly seen, by something that understood the deepest chambers of their hearts. The little foal struggled to lift her head, and this time she succeeded. With tremendous effort, she managed to stand on trembling legs, supported by her mother's gentle presence. The crowd held its collective breath, witnessing what could only be called a resurrection. Ernesto felt tears streaming down his face, knowing that their journey together was just beginning. The morning sun cast long shadows across the makeshift camp as Ernesto knelt beside the small donkey foal, his weathered hands gentle against the animal's trembling flanks. 3 days had passed since he discovered the dying family in the desert, and while the mother had begun to show signs of recovery, drinking water and nibbling at the sparse grass he'd gathered, the foal remained worryingly weak. Sarah emerged from the canvas shelter they'd erected, her blue calico dress already dusty from the desert wind. She carried a tin cup filled with water, mixed with a small portion of their precious condensed milk. "How is she this morning?" she asked, settling beside her husband. "Still breathing, but barely." Ernesto's voice carried the weight of sleepless nights spent monitoring the animals. "I fear we may lose her yet." The larger donkey, whom they'd begun calling Esperanza for the hope she represented, lifted her head at Sarah's approach. The animal's dark eyes seemed to hold an intelligence that went beyond mere instinct, watching as Sarah carefully dipped her finger in the milk mixture and brought it to the foal's lips. "Come now, little one," Sarah whispered, her voice taking on the same tone she'd once used with their children. "You must try." The foal's pink tongue darted out tentatively, tasting the mixture. For a moment, Ernesto held his breath, then released it in relief as the small animal began to lap at Sarah's finger with increasing vigor. "Praise be," he murmured, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. As the foal fed, Esperanza moved closer, her large head lowering to nuzzle Sarah's shoulder in what seemed like gratitude. The gesture was so human-like that Sarah found herself patting the donkey's neck as she might comfort a friend. "Ernesto," she said softly, never taking her eyes from the animals. "There's something different about them, something I can't quite name." He nodded, having felt it himself but lacking words to express the sensation. "They understand more than they should. Yesterday, when I was considering which direction to take when we resumed travel, Esperanza walked to the eastern path and stood there, looking back at me as if she knew. And you think she did know?" Before Ernesto could answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats reached their ears. Both pioneers rose, shading their eyes against the climbing sun to see a small group of riders emerging from the heat shimmer on the horizon. As they drew closer, Ernesto recognized the familiar figure of Brother McKinnon leading two other men from their settlement party. "Ernesto," Sarah McKinnon called as he dismounted. "We'd begun to fear the worst when you didn't return with the scouting party. We encountered a situation that required our immediate attention," Ernesto replied, gesturing toward the donkeys. McKinnon's eyes widened as he took in the scene. The makeshift shelter, the carefully tended animals, the obvious signs of an extended stay. "You've been caring for wild donkeys?" McKinnon's tone carried a mixture of disbelief and concern. "Brother, we have pressing matters to attend to. The main party is waiting for our report on water sources ahead." Sarah stood, brushing dust from her skirt. "These animals were dying, Brother McKinnon. We couldn't simply leave them to perish in the desert." One of the other men, a younger pioneer named Thomas, dismounted and approached the donkeys with curiosity. As he drew near, both Esperanza and her foal turned toward him with an alertness that seemed almost expectant. The foal, who had barely lifted her head for days, struggled to her feet and took several wobbling steps in Thomas's direction. "Well, I'll be," Thomas breathed, kneeling as the foal nuzzled against his outstretched hand. "She's taken to me like I'm kin." McKinnon frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the delay, but unable to deny what he was witnessing. "How long do you intend to remain here? The company cannot wait indefinitely." Ernesto exchanged a glance with Sarah, seeing in her eyes the same resolve he felt in his own heart. "We cannot abandon them now. They're too weak to survive on their own, but too weak to travel at the pace the company requires." "Then what do you propose?" McKinnon's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to making difficult decisions for the good of the group. "Give us 3 more days," Sarah interjected, before her husband could speak. "If they're not strong enough to travel by then, we'll—" She paused, unable to finish the sentence that would seal the animal's fate. The foal chose that moment to take several more steps, this time toward McKinnon himself. The older man looked down at the small creature, his stern expression softening despite himself as she gazed up at him with liquid brown eyes that seemed to plead for understanding. McKinnon sighed heavily, his shoulders sagging with the weight of leadership. 3 days, he said finally, then we must move on, with or without you. As the men prepared to leave, none of them noticed the way Esperanza watched their departure, her head tilted as if listening to something only she could hear. The morning sun cast long shadows across the settlement as word spread like wildfire through the dusty streets. Children abandoned their chores to peer through fence slats, mothers gathered in hushed clusters near the well, and even the most stoic of the elders found excuses to linger near Ernesto's homestead. The impossible had become commonplace, yet each new day brought fresh wonder that left the community both blessed and bewildered. Ernesto emerged from his modest cabin to find young Samuel Richardson crouched beside Esperanza, the Jenny who had first captured his heart in the desert. The boy's face was streaked with tears, but his expression held a peace that seemed far beyond his 12 years. She spoke to me, Brother Ernesto, Samuel whispered, his small hand resting gently on the donkey's neck. Not with words, but I heard her just the same. She told me Papa isn't really gone. Ernesto's throat tightened. Samuel's father had perished 3 weeks ago when his wagon overturned crossing the treacherous ravine north of town. The boy had been inconsolable until this moment. What else did she tell you, son? Samuel's eyes brightened with a clarity that made Ernesto's chest ache. That love doesn't end when breathing stops. That Papa's watching over Mama and me, same as these donkeys watch over all of us. The boy stood, brushing dust from his knees. I ain't scared anymore. As Samuel skipped toward home, Ernesto noticed Bishop Hawthorne approaching with measured steps, his weathered face creased with concern. Behind him walked 3 men Ernesto didn't recognize, their fine clothes and clean boots marking them as outsiders in this frontier settlement. Brother Martinez, the bishop called, using Ernesto's formal name. These gentlemen have traveled from Salt Lake City. They wish to witness what they've been hearing about our situation. The tallest stranger stepped forward, removing his hat to reveal silver hair and calculating eyes. Dr. Harrison Whitmore, he introduced himself with the crisp authority of education and wealth. I'm conducting research for the territorial government. We need to understand exactly what's happening here. Ernesto studied the man's face, sensing something predatory beneath the polished exterior. You're welcome to observe, Dr. Whitmore, but I'm not sure what you hope to understand. Some things can't be measured or explained. Everything can be explained, Mr. Martinez. It's simply a matter of applying proper scientific method. Whitmore gestured toward his companions. These are my associates, Dr. Fleming and Mr. Davies. We've brought equipment to document whatever phenomenon you believe you're experiencing. The donkeys, who had been peacefully grazing nearby, suddenly raised their heads in unison. Their ears swiveled toward the strangers with an alertness that made Ernesto's skin prickle. Esperanza took several steps closer, positioning herself between the men and the rest of the herd. Perhaps we should start with a demonstration, Dr. Fleming suggested, producing a leather satchel filled with metal instruments. Show us this alleged communication. It doesn't work that way, Ernesto replied, feeling heat rise in his chest. They're not performing animals. The connection comes when it's needed, when hearts are open to receive it. Whitmore exchanged a knowing look with his colleagues. Of course. How convenient that this miracle only manifests under unverifiable circumstances. Before Ernesto could respond, young Rebecca Tanner came running across the square, her face flushed with panic. Brother Martinez, come quick, it's my baby sister. She's burning with fever and won't wake up. Without hesitation, Ernesto followed Rebecca toward her family's cabin, the donkeys falling into step behind him. The strangers hurried to keep pace, their scientific instruments clanking awkwardly as they tried to document everything. Inside the one-room dwelling, they found 18-month-old Mary Tanner lying motionless in her mother's arms, her tiny face flushed crimson with fever. Sister Tanner looked up with desperate eyes. She's been like this since dawn. I've tried everything. Cool cloths, willow bark tea, nothing helps. Esperanza pushed past the humans and approached the bed with purpose. She lowered her great head until her muzzle nearly touched the child's forehead, then closed her eyes and stood perfectly still. The cabin fell silent except for the baby's labored breathing. Minutes passed like hours. Dr. Whitmore shifted impatiently while his associates positioned their instruments to capture whatever might occur. But Ernesto felt it first, a subtle change in the air, like the moment before rain when the whole world holds its breath. Mary's breathing deepened and slowed. Color began returning to normal in her cheeks. Her eyelids fluttered open, and she looked directly at Esperanza with a gurgling laugh that filled the room like sunshine. Sister Tanner gasped, pressing her hand to the child's forehead. The fever's broken. It's completely gone. She looked at Esperanza with tears streaming down her face. Thank you, thank you. Dr. Whitmore stood frozen, his scientific certainty cracking like ice in spring. Behind him, His associates fumbled with their instruments, trying desperately to find rational explanations for what defied all reason. But Ernesto saw something else in the doctor's eyes, a hunger that had nothing to do with understanding and everything to do with possession. The real test was just beginning. The telegraph lines hummed with whispered conversations that crossed state boundaries like wildfire. In Denver, a cattle rancher named Marcus Webb read the newspaper account 3 times before calling his foreman over. "You ever hear of anything like this?" he asked, tapping the article with a weathered finger. The story spoke of impossible healing, of animals responding to human touch in ways that defied every law of nature Webb had learned in 40 years of working with livestock. "Sounds like hogwash to me," his foreman replied, but his voice carried uncertainty. "Though my cousin's got a spread near the Utah border. Says there's been talk in the trading posts about some Mormon fellow who can speak to animals." Webb folded the paper carefully. He had a prize bull dying of fever, and the veterinarian had given up hope. "Saddle my horse," he said quietly. "We're taking a ride south." Meanwhile, in the governor's mansion in Salt Lake City, territorial officials gathered around a mahogany table laden with reports. The stack of testimonies had grown thick enough to choke a horse, each one more extraordinary than the last. Sheriff Anderson sat at the far end, his usual skeptical demeanor replaced by something approaching wonder. "Gentlemen," Governor Young began, his voice carrying the weight of authority, "we have a situation that requires delicate handling. The territory is drawing attention from Washington, and not all of it favorable. There are whispers of witchcraft, of ungodly practices." Dr. Harrison, recently returned from his examination of Esperanza and her family, cleared his throat. "Governor, with respect, what I witnessed cannot be dismissed as superstition. The physiological changes in those animals are documented, verifiable. The mare's leg bones show complete regeneration where there was nothing but fragments." "Which makes it all the more dangerous," replied Councilman Porter, a thin man with nervous eyes. "The federal government is already suspicious of our practices. If they believe we're harboring some kind of supernatural element." Sheriff Anderson spoke up, his voice carrying newfound conviction. "Ernesto Valdez is as God-fearing a man as any in this territory. If there's something miraculous happening, maybe we should be asking why the Lord chose one of ours to work through." The debate continued late into the night, but 300 miles away, Ernesto remained oblivious to the political machinations his actions had set in motion. He sat beside Esperanza in the pre-dawn darkness, watching her breath mist in the cold air. The other rescued animals had gathered close. The burros, the wounded hawk that now soared freely but returned each evening, and nearly 24 other creatures that had somehow found their way to this remote canyon. Maria emerged from their shelter, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "The children are asking when we might return to town," she said softly, settling beside her husband. "Little Anna misses her friends." Ernesto accepted the warm cup gratefully. "Do you think we should go back?" "I think," Maria said carefully, "that what's happening here is bigger than us. People are traveling hundreds of miles, leaving behind their normal lives. That newspaper man wasn't the first to arrive this week." She was right. The trickle of visitors had become a steady stream. Yesterday, a Ute tribal elder had appeared at the canyon's mouth, leading a lame horse and speaking in halting Spanish about ancient stories his grandfather had told. The day before, a family of German immigrants had arrived with a sick child and a dying milk cow, having heard rumors in the settlement towns. Ernesto had tried to explain to each visitor that he possessed no special power, that whatever happened seemed to flow through him rather than from him. But they watched with hungry eyes as he laid hands on their suffering animals, witnessed the inexplicable healings, and went away changed. "Perhaps," Ernesto murmured, "this canyon was chosen for a purpose we don't yet understand." As if responding to his words, Esperanza lifted her head and nicked softly. In the growing light, her coat gleamed with health that should have been impossible. But more than physical restoration marked her transformation. There was an intelligence in her dark eyes that seemed almost human, a depth of understanding that made Ernesto's breath catch. The other animals began to stir, and Ernesto noticed something he'd been observing for days but hadn't quite believed. They moved with subtle coordination, as if responding to signals invisible to human perception. The hawk would circle when strangers approached. The burros would position themselves protectively around the weaker animals, and Esperanza seemed to serve as some kind of gentle commander of this impossible menagerie. "Maria," Ernesto whispered, "I think we're witnessing something that will change everything we understand about the natural world." His wife squeezed his hand. "Then we'd better be ready for what comes next." In the distance, dust clouds on the horizon announced another day of pilgrims seeking miracles in an increasingly uncertain world. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert floor as Ernesto emerged from his tent to find the donkey family already awake, their ears twitching in perfect synchronization. Something had changed overnight. He could feel it in the air, thick with an energy that made his skin prickle. The wounded Jenny, whom he'd been certain would not survive another day, stood steadily on all four legs, her breathing no longer labored. "Impossible," he whispered, running his weathered hands along her flanks, where deep gashes had been the night before. Only faint silver lines remained, like ancient scars that had healed decades ago rather than hours. The Jenny turned her great dark eyes toward him, and in that gaze, Ernesto saw something that made his breath catch in his throat, an intelligence that seemed to peer directly into his soul. Behind him he heard the rustle of canvas, as members of his wagon train began to stir. Soon they would see what he was seeing, and then what? How could he explain something he didn't understand himself? The other donkeys, the jack and the foal, pressed close to their recovered family member, creating a tight circle that hummed with an almost musical resonance. "Brother Valdez?" Sarah's voice carried across the camp. "Is everything well?" Ernesto turned to see her approaching, her face etched with the concern that had become her constant companion since they'd discovered the dying animals 3 days prior. She stopped short when she saw the Jenny standing, her hand flying to cover her mouth. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Ernesto said quietly, though even as the words left his lips, he wondered if divine intervention could account for what he was witnessing. The Jenny's recovery defied every law of nature he understood. Sarah approached slowly, her eyes wide with wonder. How is this possible? Last night she could barely lift her head. Before Ernesto could respond, a commotion erupted from the main camp. Shouts of alarm mixed with sounds of confusion as the other pioneers discovered that their own livestock, horses, oxen, and mules that had been showing signs of desert fatigue, were now standing alert and vigorous, as if they'd been grazing in green pastures instead of struggling across barren wasteland. "The animals!" Jacob called out as he rushed toward them, his usually composed demeanor shattered by amazement. They're all perfectly healthy. Even old Moses." He gestured toward his ancient ox, who was normally slow and arthritic. "He's moving like a young bull." The donkey family began to move then, not away from the camp as Ernesto had expected, but toward it. The other livestock turned their heads in unison as the donkeys approached, creating a strange tableau of interspecies attention that sent chills down Ernesto's spine. Whatever was happening extended far beyond the miracle of one animal's recovery. "We need to discuss this," Elder Morrison's voice cut through the morning air, his tone carrying the authority of church leadership and the uncertainty of a man confronting the inexplicable. "Gather the families. There are questions that need answers." As the pioneers assembled in the center of their makeshift camp, Ernesto found himself reluctantly cast as the focal point of their attention. The donkey family positioned themselves nearby, their presence both comforting and unsettling. He could feel their awareness, as if they were not merely observing but actively participating in whatever revelation was unfolding. "Tell us again about finding them," Elder Morrison commanded, his eyes shifting between Ernesto and the donkeys. Leave out nothing. Ernesto recounted the discovery, the decision to help despite their limited resources, the strange dreams that had visited him each night since. As he spoke, he noticed the animals, not just the donkeys, but all the livestock, growing still and attentive, as if they too were listening to his words. "And you're certain that Jenny was dying?" Elder Morrison pressed. "I've seen death often enough to recognize its approach," Ernesto replied. "She should not be alive." A murmur rippled through the gathered families. Some spoke of miracles and divine blessing, while others whispered concerns about witchcraft or unholy influences. Ernesto watched their faces, seeing his own confusion reflected in their expressions. The Jenny stepped forward then, approaching Elder Morrison with deliberate purpose. The church leader instinctively stepped back, but the donkeys simply regarded him with those impossibly deep eyes before turning to each person in the circle, as if taking their measure. She's looking at us like she understands," Sarah breathed. The foal, emboldened by its mother's example, trotted to young Timothy Watson and nuzzled his hand. The boy laughed with delight, but his laughter died when the foal began to trace patterns in the sand with its hoof, geometric shapes that looked almost like symbols or letters. Elder Morrison knelt to examine the markings, his face pale in the morning light. "What is the meaning of this?" The donkey family exchanged glances that seemed far too knowing for mere animals, and Ernesto realized that their rescue had opened a door to something beyond his comprehension, something that would challenge everything they believed about the natural world. The morning sun cast long shadows across the settlement as Ernesto emerged from the barn, his weathered hands still trembling from what he'd witnessed. Esperanza stood at his side, her coat gleaming like burnished copper in the dawn light, while her foal pressed close against her flank. The other settlers had gathered in a loose semicircle, their faces a mixture of wonder and uncertainty. "Tell us again what you saw," Elder Morrison requested, his voice carrying the weight of authority but also genuine curiosity. The man's steel-grey beard couldn't hide the bewilderment in his eyes. Ernesto cleared his throat, knowing how impossible his words would sound. The foal was still, cold, had been for near an hour. He paused, watching the healthy young donkey now nuzzling its mother's neck. "Esperanza, she placed her muzzle against him and breathed, not like any breathing I've seen before, like she was giving him her very soul." Sarah Chen stepped forward from the crowd, her medical training making her the closest thing to a doctor they had. "May I examine the foal?" she asked softly. Ernesto nodded, and Sarah approached with careful, measured steps. Esperanza watched her with those impossibly intelligent eyes, but didn't retreat. The foal stood perfectly still as Sarah's practiced hands moved over his small frame, checking heartbeat, breathing, reflexes. "His vital signs are strong," Sarah announced, her voice thick with confusion. "Stronger than they should be for an animal that went through such trauma during birth." She looked up at Ernesto. "There's something else. His coat pattern. It's changed." The crowd murmured among themselves as they noticed what Sarah had observed. Where the foal had been born, a simple brown, now silver markings traced elegant patterns across his hide, forming shapes that seemed to shift and dance in the morning light. Old Henrik, who'd been silent until now, shuffled forward with his walking stick. The Norwegian immigrant had seen more of life than most, and his opinion carried weight in their small community. "In the old country we had stories," he said, his accent thick with memory. "Animals touched by something beyond our understanding. They called them bridge walkers, creatures that existed between worlds." "Henrik, please," Elder Morrison began, but the old man raised his hand. "Let an old fool speak his piece, Samuel. I've lived through famine, war, and the crossing of an ocean. I know the difference between superstition and miracle." Henrik's pale blue eyes fixed on Esperanza. "That animal there, she's no ordinary donkey. Haven't you all felt it? The way the other animals respond to her? The way plants seem to grow greener where she grazes?" Ernesto felt his heart pound as Henrik voiced what he'd been afraid to acknowledge. Over the past weeks, he had noticed changes, not just in Esperanza, but in everything around her. The patch of struggling vegetables near the barn had flourished overnight after she'd wandered through it. The milk cow, previously temperamental and prone to illness, now produced twice her usual amount since Esperanza's arrival. "There's more," Ernesto found himself saying, surprising everyone, including himself. "Yesterday, when I was working the field with the oxen, they were exhausted from the heat, ready to collapse. Esperanza approached them, touched each one with her muzzle, and—" He trailed off, seeing the skeptical faces around him. "And what, Ernesto?" Sarah prompted gently. "They were renewed, like they'd just begun the day's work instead of ending it. They plowed for another 4 hours without stopping." The silence that followed was broken only by the whisper of wind through the settlement and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. The foal chose that moment to take his first tentative steps away from his mother, and as he did, something extraordinary happened. Where his hooves touched the dusty ground, tiny wildflowers began to bloom, desert lupine and Indian paintbrush, flowers that shouldn't exist in this harsh soil. "Sweet Jesus," whispered Mary Patterson, clutching her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Elder Morrison removed his hat, running his fingers through his thinning hair. As a man of faith, he'd always believed in miracles, but witnessing one challenged every practical bone in his body. "What do you think this means, Ernesto? Why has this blessing come to you?" Before Ernesto could answer, Esperanza approached him and placed her head against his chest, just as she had that first day in the desert. The touch brought with it a flood of sensations, not images exactly, but feelings and knowings that transcended language. He sensed vast distances and ancient purposes, connections between all living things that humans had forgotten how to perceive. "I don't think it's about me," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think she was waiting, all those generations of her kind, waiting for the right moment, the right circumstances, to show us something we've lost." The foal had wandered to the edge of their circle, leaving a trail of impossible flowers in his wake. As the settlers watched in amazement, he lifted his small head toward the mountains and released a sound that was part bray, part song, a call that seemed to echo across the desert and into their very souls. The morning sun cast long shadows across the camp as Ernesto knelt beside the small pond, watching the donkey family drink. 3 weeks had passed since the miraculous rain, and the transformation continued to astound him. Where once there had been cracked earth and dying scrub, now green shoots pushed through rich soil. The water that had appeared seemed inexhaustible, fed by some underground spring that defied the harsh reality of the desert. Miguel approached, his boots crunching on the moist earth. "The wagon train from Salt Lake arrives today," he said, settling beside his friend. "Brother Whitmore sent word they're bringing supplies and fresh oxen." Ernesto nodded, but didn't look away from the donkeys. The mother, whom he'd begun calling Esperanza, had grown sleek and strong. Her coat gleamed with health, and her eyes held an intelligence that sometimes unnerved him. The foal, now steady on his legs, frolicked at the water's edge, while his father stood guard nearby. "What will you tell them?" Miguel asked quietly. It was the question that had haunted Ernesto for days. How could he explain what had happened here? The church leaders would demand answers, would want to understand the nature of the miracle. Some would call it divine providence. Others might whisper of things darker, more mysterious. "The truth," Ernesto said finally, "though I'm not certain I understand it myself." A distant rumble drew their attention to the eastern horizon, where dust clouds marked the approaching wagon train. Ernesto felt his stomach tighten. Soon this peaceful sanctuary would be invaded by questions, examinations, and the weight of expectations he wasn't prepared to bear. As if sensing his unease, Esperanza lifted her head from the water and fixed him with her steady gaze. In that moment, Ernesto felt something pass between them, a communication beyond words, beyond the normal boundaries between species. She understood what was coming. The first wagons appeared as specks against the morning sky, growing larger as they navigated the rocky terrain. Ernesto counted at least a dozen, more than he'd expected. Word of the miracle had clearly spread further than Brother Whitmore had indicated. "Perhaps we should prepare the others," Miguel suggested, referring to the small group of settlers who had remained at the camp. They'll have questions too. Ernesto stood, brushing dust from his knees. Yes, gather everyone. We'll meet them together. As Miguel hurried away, Ernesto remained by the pond. The donkey family had finished drinking and now grazed on the new grass that carpeted the area. The scene was so peaceful, so normal, that for a moment he could almost forget the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them to this point. The memory of that night still haunted him, the moment when desperation had driven him to his knees, when he'd pleaded not with God but with the dying donkey herself. He'd seen something in her eyes then, a flicker of understanding that had preceded the impossible rain. But what force had answered his plea? What power moved through these creatures that could bend nature itself to their will? The wagon train drew closer, and Ernesto could now make out individual riders. At the head rode Elder Morrison, a stern man from Salt Lake whose reputation for skepticism preceded him. Behind him came others Ernesto recognized: church leaders, territorial officials, and what appeared to be a small group of Eastern gentlemen whose presence puzzled him. Brother Whitmore broke away from the group and spurred his horse ahead, arriving at the camp in a cloud of dust. His face bore a mixture of excitement and concern as he dismounted. "Brother Ernesto," he called, striding forward with obvious urgency. "You must prepare yourself. Elder Morrison brings questions from Salt Lake City, and those gentlemen with him." He paused, glancing back at the approaching wagons. "They're naturalists from the university in Boston. Word has reached even there." Ernesto felt the weight of unwanted attention settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. "What do they want?" "To study the animals, the land, everything. They speak of scientific examination, of documenting what they call anomalous phenomena." Brother Whitmore's voice carried a warning. "Be careful what you tell them, my friend. There are some who would see darkness where others see divine intervention." The main body of the wagon train had now reached the camp's perimeter. Elder Morrison sat his horse with military bearing, his sharp eyes already cataloguing every detail of the transformed landscape. The Eastern gentlemen clustered nearby, their clean clothes and pale skin marking them as clearly as foreigners in this harsh country. One held what appeared to be some kind of scientific instrument, while another sketched frantically in a leather-bound notebook. Esperanza had moved closer during the conversation, her foal pressed against her side. She watched the newcomers with alert wariness, as if she too understood that their peaceful existence was about to change forever. Ernesto placed a gentle hand on her neck, feeling the strong pulse of life beneath his palm. Whatever came next, whatever questions or challenges these men brought with them, he knew his loyalty lay with the creatures who had taught him that miracles could emerge from the simplest acts of compassion. The reckoning had arrived. The dawn sky stretched crimson over the Utah desert as Ernesto knelt beside Luna, her breathing shallow but steady. 3 weeks had passed since the inexplicable healing, yet the mystery deepened with each sunrise. The other donkeys, Esperanza, Cielo, and Little Milagro, had not only survived but thrived beyond anything nature should have allowed. Their coats gleamed with an otherworldly luster, their eyes held depths that seemed almost human, and their movements carried a grace that defied their humble species. Word of the miracle had spread through the scattered Mormon settlements like wildfire through dry brush. Pilgrims arrived daily, some seeking healing for their own ailments, others simply hoping to witness what many were calling divine intervention. Ernesto found himself uncomfortable with the attention, but he couldn't deny what he'd seen with his own eyes. Brother Matthias, the stern church elder from Salt Lake City, had arrived the previous evening with a contingent of church officials. His weathered face bore the skepticism of a man who'd seen too many false prophets and desperate souls grasping at impossible hope. Now he stood at the edge of Ernesto's makeshift camp, watching the donkeys with calculating eyes. "These are extraordinary claims, Brother Ernesto," Matthias said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. The Church cannot endorse every tale of wonder that emerges from the wilderness. Ernesto nodded respectfully, though his jaw tightened. I make no claims, brother. I simply care for these animals as the Lord guided me to do. Luna lifted her head at the sound of his voice, and Ernesto felt that familiar warmth spread through his chest, the connection that had grown stronger each day since her recovery. It wasn't just affection for a rescued animal, it was something deeper, more profound. Sometimes he could almost sense her thoughts, feel her contentment or concern as if it were his own. A commotion arose from the other side of the camp where a small crowd had gathered. Mary Hutchinson, a young mother from the Cedar Valley settlement, had brought her fever-stricken infant. The baby had been burning with sickness for days, and the local physicians had given little hope. Desperate, she'd made the arduous journey after hearing whispered stories of miraculous healings. Please, she pleaded, tears streaming down her dust-covered cheeks. If God works through these creatures, surely he would heal an innocent child. Ernesto felt the weight of every eye upon him. He'd never claimed the donkeys could heal others, never suggested their recovery was anything more than divine providence. Yet people came seeking miracles, and he struggled with how to respond to their faith and desperation. Brother Matthias stepped forward, his voice firm but not unkind. Sister Hutchinson, we cannot place our faith in superstition. Prayer and proper medical care are... He stopped mid-sentence as Luna rose to her feet and walked directly toward the woman and her child. The donkey moved with that ethereal grace Ernesto had come to recognize, her dark eyes focused intently on the bundle in Mary's arms. Without hesitation or fear, the mother instinctively lowered the baby toward Luna. What happened next defied rational explanation. Luna gently nuzzled the infant's forehead, breathing softly across the child's fevered skin. A visible shimmer seemed to pass between them, not quite light, not quite heat, but something tangible that made the air itself seem alive with possibility. The baby's crying ceased immediately. Color returned to the pale cheeks, and tiny eyes opened clear and bright for the first time in days. Mary gasped, pressing her ear to her child's chest, then broke into sobbing laughter as she felt the strong, steady heartbeat. Brother Matthias stumbled backward, his face pale beneath his weathered tan. The assembled crowd fell silent, some dropping to their knees in prayer, others making the sign of the cross. Ernesto felt his own knees weaken as he witnessed something that transcended his understanding of the natural world. Luna returned to his side, settling down as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But Ernesto noticed the faintest tremor in her legs, a slight dulling of her lustrous coat. Whatever force worked through her, it extracted its own cost. This cannot be, Brother Matthias whispered, his authoritative composure cracking. Animals are creatures without souls, without divine purpose beyond serving man. Ernesto placed a protective hand on Luna's neck, feeling the rapid pulse beneath her warm skin. Perhaps, he said quietly, we've misunderstood what it means to serve. As word of the infant's healing spread through the crowd, more desperate souls pressed forward. The lame, the sick, the broken-hearted. Ernesto felt overwhelmed by their need, by expectations he never asked for and couldn't fully comprehend. Yet looking into Luna's eyes, he saw not just acceptance but purpose, as if she understood her role in something far greater than either of them could fathom. The desert wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of distant storms and the weight of changes yet to come. The morning sun cast long shadows across the makeshift camp as Ernesto knelt beside Esperanza, running his weathered hands along her flanks. The donkey's breathing had grown labored during the night, and her eyes held a distant quality that chilled him to his bones. Around them, the other members of the rescued family, Corazon, Cielo, and little Milagro, pressed close, their usual playful energy replaced by a solemn vigil. She's calling to them, whispered Sarah, the settlement's healer who had arrived at dawn with Brother Matthews and several other church elders. Can you hear it? Ernesto nodded, though he couldn't explain what he was hearing. It wasn't sound in any conventional sense, but rather a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the very air around them. The other donkeys had begun to hum, a low harmonic tone that seemed to emanate not just from their throats but from their entire beings. Brother Matthews stepped forward, his usual stern demeanor softened by something approaching wonder. "Ernesto, what you've witnessed here, what we're all witnessing, it challenges everything we thought we knew about the Lord's creatures." The humming grew stronger, and Ernesto felt it in his chest, in his bones. It was the same sensation he'd experienced that first day in the desert when he'd found them dying, when Esperanza had somehow communicated their need without words. But this was different, deeper, more profound. It felt like a summoning. "Look!" Sarah gasped, pointing toward the horizon. In the distance, a dust cloud was rising, but not from any wind or storm. As it drew closer, Ernesto could make out shapes moving within it, dozens of animals converging on their location. Wild horses thundered across the plateau, their manes streaming. Coyotes loped alongside deer, natural enemies moving together in perfect harmony. Birds of every description filled the sky above, their wings creating patterns that seemed almost choreographed. "Impossible," breathed Brother Matthews, but his voice held reverence rather than disbelief. The animals formed a great circle around the camp, and as they settled into place, their own voices joined the donkeys' humming. Each species contributed its own note, the horses' deep whickers, the coyotes' haunting calls, the varied songs of the birds, creating a symphony unlike anything Ernesto had ever imagined. Esperanza lifted her head with effort, and her eyes found Ernesto's. In that gaze he saw not just intelligence but wisdom, and something that looked remarkably like gratitude. She was saying goodbye, he realized, but also something more. She was passing on a gift, a responsibility. The humming reached a crescendo, and suddenly Ernesto understood. The bond he'd formed with this donkey family wasn't unique, it was universal. Every creature possessed this capacity for connection, this ability to communicate beyond the barriers of species. Humans had simply forgotten how to listen. Esperanza's breathing slowed, and as it did, the gathered animals began to quiet their voices one by one. But instead of silence, something else filled the air. A sense of peace so profound it seemed to sanctify the very ground they stood upon. The old donkey's eyes closed gently, and with her final breath, she released something into the world that Ernesto felt wash over him like warm water. The transformation was immediate and undeniable. When Ernesto looked at the wild animals surrounding them, he could sense their thoughts, their emotions, their individual personalities as clearly as if they were speaking aloud. The lead stallion's protective pride in his herd, the coyote mother's concern for her pups hidden in a nearby den, the hawk's joy in the thermal currents that lifted her skyward. "Dear God in heaven," whispered Brother Matthews, and Ernesto realized the elder was experiencing the same revelation. Sarah was weeping quietly, her hand pressed to her heart, while the other church members stood transfixed. But it wasn't just the humans who had changed. The animals, too, seemed newly aware, their gazes holding a depth of understanding that bridged the gap between wild and tame, between human and beast. They began to disperse slowly, reluctantly, but Ernesto knew this wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. Corazon nudged him gently, and through their connection, Ernesto felt the donkey's determination to carry on Esperanza's work. The bond would not die with her. Instead, it would spread, touching every creature willing to open their heart to the possibility of true communication. As the last of the wild animals disappeared into the distance, Ernesto knelt beside Esperanza's still form and placed his hand on her neck one final time. The gift she had given them was both humbling and overwhelming. The ability to truly understand that all of creation was connected, that the barriers between species were illusions born of humanity's forgotten wisdom. "What do we do now?" asked Sarah, her voice barely above a whisper. Ernesto stood slowly, looking at the faces around him, human and animal alike, all forever changed by what they had witnessed and received. "We remember," he said simply, "and we teach others to listen." The morning sun cast long shadows across the settlement as Ernesto walked slowly toward the center of town, his weathered hands trembling slightly at his sides. Word had spread overnight about what the children had witnessed, the donkeys speaking in human tongues, their eyes filled with an intelligence that seemed to transcend the natural world. By the time he reached the meeting ground, nearly every soul in the community had gathered. Elder Matthias stood at the center of the crowd, his black coat stark against the pale desert backdrop. His grey beard was perfectly groomed despite the early hour, and his eyes held the weight of authority that had guided their community through countless trials. The assembled pioneers formed a rough circle, their faces a mixture of curiosity, fear, and reverence. "Brother Ernesto," Matthias began, his voice carrying easily across the silent gathering. "We've heard remarkable claims about the creatures you rescued. The children speak of miracles, of divine intervention through these humble beasts. Tell us what you have witnessed." Ernesto felt the weight of every gaze upon him. These were his people, families who had crossed impossible distances together, who had carved a life from the unforgiving wilderness through shared faith and determination. He owed them the truth, no matter how extraordinary it might sound. "What the children say is true," he said, his voice steady despite his inner turmoil. "The donkeys speak, not with their voices, but something deeper. Words form in your mind when you're near them, clear as if spoken aloud. They know things about us, about this place, about events that haven't yet come to pass." A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd. Some faces showed wonder, others skepticism. Elder Matthias raised his hand for silence. "These are serious claims, brother. In our faith, we believe in miracles, in the divine revealing itself through unexpected channels. But we must also be cautious of deception, of signs that might lead us astray." He paused, studying Ernesto's face. "What exactly do these creatures say?" Ernesto closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the profound communication he had experienced. "They speak of purpose, of being brought here not by chance but by design. They know our names, our struggles, our hopes for this settlement. Yesterday, the mother told young Sarah about water beneath the eastern ridge, specific instructions for finding it. When the men dug where she indicated, they found the sweetest spring we've discovered yet." "That could be coincidence," called out Brother Hansen from the crowd. "Animals have instincts about water sources." "Perhaps," Ernesto acknowledged. "But they also speak of the future. They've warned of a harsh winter coming, harsher than we've prepared for. They describe where to find shelter for our livestock, which crops will fail and which will survive. They know things that no earthly creature should know." Elder Matthias stepped closer, his expression thoughtful. "And what do you believe, Brother Ernesto? In your heart, what do you think these creatures are?" The question hung in the air like morning mist. Ernesto looked around at the faces surrounding him, neighbors who had become family, people who had trusted him with their lives during the long journey west. His gaze found Maria among the crowd, her eyes encouraging him to speak his truth. "I believe," he said slowly, "that the Lord works through vessels we might not expect. When I found them dying in the desert, I felt compelled to act. Though saving them seemed impossible, every day since, they've grown stronger while blessing our community in ways that defy explanation. They ask for nothing but water and simple food, yet they offer wisdom that could ensure our survival." A voice from the back called out, "But is it godly wisdom or something else? How do we know these creatures aren't a test of our faith?" Elder Matthias nodded thoughtfully. "Brother Johnson raises an important point. We must discern carefully." He turned back to Ernesto. "What fruit has their presence borne? Are we becoming more faithful or less? Are we drawn closer to the Lord or further away?" Ernesto considered the question carefully. Since their arrival, our community has grown stronger. Neighbors help neighbors more readily. Children show greater kindness to animals and each other. The sick have found comfort in their presence. Mrs. Anderson's fever broke after spending an afternoon near them. Old grievances have been set aside as people work together to care for them and follow their guidance. "These sound like good fruits," admitted Elder Matthias. "But we must proceed with both faith and wisdom." He addressed the gathering. "I propose we spend the day in fasting and prayer, seeking divine guidance about these extraordinary circumstances. Tomorrow, the elders will meet with Brother Ernesto and these remarkable creatures. We will seek spiritual confirmation of their purpose among us." As the crowd began to disperse, people approached Ernesto with questions, expressions of support, and a few skeptical challenges. Through it all, he felt a strange peace settling over him. Whatever tomorrow might bring, he knew his life had been forever changed by that moment of compassion in the desert. The donkeys were waiting for him when he returned home, their knowing eyes reflecting an ancient wisdom that seemed to encompass both earth and heaven. The sun painted the Utah sky in shades of amber and rose as Ernesto stood before the gathered crowd at the edge of Zion's settlement. Word had spread through the valley like wildfire. The man who spoke with donkeys, who had witnessed miracles in the desert, was ready to tell his story one final time before departing on a journey that would take him far from the familiar red rocks and sagebrush of home. Maria stood beside him, her weathered hand clasped in his, while Esperanza grazed peacefully nearby with her reunited family. The three donkeys had grown strong again, their coats gleaming in the morning light, but it was something deeper that had changed in them, a kind of knowing that seemed to bridge the ancient gap between human and animal understanding. "I came to this desert seeking a new life," Ernesto began, his voice carrying easily across the hushed assembly. "I thought I knew what that meant. A good home, honest work, a place where Maria and I could grow old together in peace. But the desert had other plans." He gestured toward Esperanza, who lifted her great head as if recognizing her part in the tale. "When I found them dying in that canyon, I made a choice that seemed simple at the time. You help where help is needed. You don't walk away from suffering when you have the power to ease it. But what I discovered was that the helping went both ways." Elder Hansen, who had ridden out to witness the departure, nodded slowly. Behind him, dozens of settlers from neighboring homesteads had gathered, people who had heard whispers of the impossible, of communication that transcended words, of healings that defied medical explanation. "The first time I heard Esperanza's voice in my mind, I thought the desert heat had addled my brain," Ernesto continued, a gentle smile playing at his lips. "But Maria reminded me of something important. Miracles don't always announce themselves with trumpets and thunder. Sometimes they whisper, sometimes they come wearing the coat of an old donkey who's seen too much sorrow." Maria stepped forward, her own voice strong despite her years. "What my husband learned out there in the wasteland was something our people have always known but sometimes forget. We are all connected. Every creature, every growing thing, every grain of sand and drop of water. The donkeys didn't just receive healing. They were part of it, teachers in their own right." A young boy in the crowd raised his hand. "Will you come back, Señor Ernesto?" Ernesto knelt to meet the child's eyes. "The desert has called us to carry this gift beyond these mountains, to find others who need healing, both animals and people. But the story doesn't end with our leaving. It continues with each of you, every time you choose compassion over convenience, understanding over fear." He stood and walked to Esperanza, placing his palm against her neck. The connection that had started as desperate whispers between dying creatures had evolved into something profound, a bridge of empathy that had already begun to spread to others who were open to receiving it. "The territorial government has asked us to establish a sanctuary," Maria explained to the gathered crowd. "A place where injured animals can heal and where people can learn to listen with more than their ears. It's work that will take us across many states, but it's work that was born here, in this red earth, through the grace of creatures who refuse to give up hope." Elder Hansen stepped forward with a leather pouch heavy with silver coins. "The community wanted to contribute to your mission," he said formally, then his voice softened. "Truth is, Ernesto, what you've shown us has changed how we see our place in creation. That's a gift worth more than money." As the crowd began to disperse, Individuals and families approached to offer their own tokens, jerked meat for the journey, hand-knitted blankets, letters to be delivered to distant relatives. Each goodbye carried the weight of genuine transformation, lives touched by witnessing something that challenged the boundaries of the possible. The wagon was loaded, the donkey family secure in a specially built traveling enclosure that would allow them to walk or ride as the journey demanded. As Ernesto climbed onto the driver's seat beside Maria, he felt the familiar warmth of Esperanza's thoughts touching his mind. Not words exactly, but emotions rich with gratitude and anticipation. The desert stretched endlessly before them, no longer the harsh wasteland that had nearly claimed 4 lives, but a vast canvas of possibility. Behind them, the settlement of Zion continued its daily rhythm, forever changed by the knowledge that miracles often came disguised as ordinary acts of kindness. As their wagon rolled toward the horizon, Esperanza's gentle bray echoed off the canyon walls, a sound that seemed to carry both farewell and promise, the voice of hope itself singing into the endless blue morning.